At one point, a junior executive reached into his pocket and said, well, we've got some notes for you. Would you like to hear them? And we both said at the same time, no. It's almost like, they won't take kindly to this analogy, but it was like training a dog. You know, Mel Brooks said the funniest thing to me ever. He said, whenever you're in a meeting with these guys, just tell them you'll do everything. Say yes to everything. And then don't do any of it because they're not going to remember. That's not their job.
What did you learn from Bochco?
I met Steve when I was only 19 years old, just coming out of Carnegie Mellon. So he became my mentor at Universal that first summer that I started working, and made all the introductions and was enormously helpful in helping me navigate at that time, the preponderance of the industry was produced at Universal Television. I then took a break for a few years to come back and work as a playwright. And when I came back, Stephen had finally hit the jackpot with Hill Street, which had come on as a mid-season replacement its first season, and then was curtailed in the second year by a writer's strike.
Right.
I arrived right at the start of the third year, which was really kind of when it hit its stride and when we moved beyond just a critic's darling and became a hit show.
Twin Peaks is so different, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, did it help you with structure and understanding of structure and characters? Like, what did you get from it?
Because it was a team sport at Hill Street. I'd been an athlete, I'd played team sports all my life, and I learned this approach to creating television as kind of a team sport. And that made sense to me. Everybody had their role, everybody tried to contribute, but you also had specialists who could do as needed certain things. For instance, it got to the point where we all insisted, I can only tell this because they're both gone now, that Stephen write all the scenes that his then wife, Barbara Boston, was in, because we couldn't figure out how to shoehorn her into all the stories we were doing. Right. So everybody had their kind of assigned roles. Given that opportunity, we were on the set at Radford in Studio City. I spent as much time as I could on set. You know, I came from the world of theater and understanding production and being backstage. So I took advantage of that and spent as much time as I could down there, haunted the editing rooms, followed directors. I ended up directing an episode the second year I was there. So it was a kind of a master's course in the state of the art and how do you produce American television.
So where do you meet David Lynch? Do you just run into him somewhere? Do you guys become friends? Or
we had a mutual agent then at CAA who, after I left Hill Street after those 3 years, and I actually got my first feature gig right away. I was writing a movie with John Schlesinger that eventually became a picture called The Believers. So I was interested in film and working in the movies. And so we met ostensibly as part of a package. I was going to adapt a book called Goddess by an author named Anthony Summers about Marilyn Monroe. He was a serious investigative reporter, the first guy who kind of opened up the Pandora's box of her association with the Kennedys and the possible role that the mob had played in her demise. And I wrote that film for United Artists with David attached as a director. So that was the first thing that brought us together. He was off making Blue Velvet at the time. So I really more or less wrote the picture on my own. And this is a classic Hollywood story. We turned it in on a Friday to United Artists, as I remember. And Monday morning at about 8 a.m., I got a call from the producer saying we were in turnaround already because they had neglected to vet the fact that Ethel Kennedy was on the board at the time.
Right.
So needless to say, it made for an upward pairing. However, David and I had really gotten along and felt a real kind of cohesiveness of spirit and also a point of view. So we then wrote a picture together, a comedy that we came up with, a bizarre comedy for Dino De Laurentiis called One Saliva Bubble, which later became a kind of legendarily unmade movie.
Sure. I know.
And we were 6 weeks away from production with Martin Short and Steve Martin both playing dual roles. It would have been unbelievably funny, I think. And Dino ran out of money. In typical Dino fashion, he pulled the plug on everything he had going. He gave David the rights to the script back. And then we were noodling around, okay, well, what can we do next? And that's when an agent of ours from CAA mentioned, ABC is interested in talking to you guys about anything really. They were cellar dwellers in the 3-horse race. So we happened to walk in there at precisely the right moment when they were ready to kind of close their eyes and hold their breath and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And after a somewhat bizarre first meeting, in which we just simply said we had this idea about a kind of murder mystery. At that point, I think it was set in North Dakota. And David made this famous gesture with he was great at making these sort of gnomic references that pulled people forward to the edge of their seat. He said, a girl dies, and through the investigation of this crime, we're going to learn the whole ecosystem of a town and the people and the families and the secrets. And the investigation reveals everything. And then he said, and he made this gesture, and there's this wind. And I always thought, did he hypnotize them in that moment?
Right.
We left the meeting and they called while we were still in the car on the way back and said, they want to have another meeting and move forward.
Wow. Amazing.
So it was crazy. At which point, just to finish the story, before we got to that second meeting, there was another writer's strike, which delayed this for almost a year. At which point, we were on to other things, and they called us up and said, remember that thing you came in and told us about? And we sort of vaguely did. So we went back and had the second meeting. And out of that came, the firm, go ahead and write the pilot.
Now, the supernatural elements, you obviously didn't have that on Hill Street Blues. Did you bond with David about that right away? Because he obviously had a lot of that in his work in the past,
Yeah, that was definitely part of my general field of interest in life. I mean, look, as a playwright, I studied Sean O'Casey and surrealistic theater and the avant-garde. I wrote a play about Antonin Artaud, for God's sakes, in college. So
right.
I was interested in, the mystic and all of those things, and had done a lot of study on my own. So we had a good kind of fit with bringing in that sort of material, not just horror for horror's sake, but hinting at some kind of cosmology that was greater than what heaven and earth can reveal to us.
At the same time you're doing that, you're also writing novels. So you had time to do both?
I mean, I wrote novels when I was a kid, and I had written them all through my 20s when I really focused on playwriting. But I didn't start the novel until we actually got on the air and made, the impact that we did. During that time, I felt we could do some books associated with the show. The history of books associated with television shows was pretty lame at that point. I mean, you might get an occasional cookbook or the making of, but there was nothing that formed a sort of tributary channel of backstory and building out a world. So I suggested we do the Diary of Laura Palmer, which had been such a key component of the story. And we hired David's daughter, Jennifer, to write it from an outline that I gave her. And to everybody's shock and amazement, it hit number one on the New York Times bestseller list for like 6 weeks in a row. And
wow.
So then I said, well, let's do 2 more. I wrote the first 100 pages or so of a book.
Is that the list of 7?
List of 7, yeah.
Yeah. In those first 100 pages, did you already mix the historical facts? And was that an idea that came in quite early?
Yeah, it's so weird. The whole thing came to me in a Scrabble game, believe it or not. I suddenly had the tiles out in front of me and I spelled the name Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
I thought, well, what is that an anagram for? Maybe there's another name for Holmes. And then it just hit me like, what if there was a guy that inspired Conan Doyle to write this character, which we've never heard about? He was an optometrist or an ophthalmologist at that point, a struggling one at that. Wouldn't that be a fun story to tell? That's how the book came to be. And it also really took off. And so that other side of my career got a good launch.
So the symbolism in Twin Peaks, are there themes that are recurring in Twin Peaks?
Oh, absolutely. I think the persistence of evil in human existence was something that really interested us and that we wanted to explore. And is this something that is singular to man, humankind, I should say? Or is it in fact something separate and apart from us that exists independently of us?
Did you come to a conclusion on that?
No, but I came to the point where I'm securely on the fence. I don't think it's one or the other necessarily.
When you have a thought like that, do you have to say, okay, Wyndham Earle is going to embody these ideas of evil and we're going to put those ideas into this person?
Yeah, he was a good vehicle for bringing that into the story. And look, I always had it sounds kind of a weird reference, but there was a sort of Arthurian quality to these myths of the woods and the darkness, and the log lady obviously was like the witch who lived in the woods, who spoke through channels that most of us don't have access to. And so the idea that something was dwelling in those woods that might have entered or affected the town became central to us. And I think it was really the first dream sequence we came up with. If I may, there's a funny story attached with that. To make the pilot, as you know, you have to obtain ancillary funding to make up the gap between a license fee and the actual cost of production. So we had sold that idea to Aaron Spelling's company, which is how I met Aaron. And I came to know him really well as a person and as a businessman. I can't say I was a huge fan of his work. I mean, what he did was very specific, and there's no argument he was extremely good at what he did. It just didn't personally interest me.
Right.
But he was a lovely guy, and he gave me two pieces of advice, which were the best I ever got. One was, own the show. Don't sign it over to a studio and let them use their apparatus to sell it. I'll rent you our distribution system for foreign. It'll make up your gap. You guys can own the negative and own the show, and go with that model. And that's what we did.
Can you imagine that happening now?
No, it could never happen now.
Yeah.
I mean, and he was one of the last of the real independents to make that work. But there was one small caveat. The movie could be self-contained and sold as a foreign feature if the pilot wasn't picked up for series, if we added like a 2.5-minute rough button at the end of the show that purported to round off the story.
Right.
So that's where we first came up with the whole alternative world of Fire Walk with Me and the man from another place, and the idea of possession, which David shot in like one afternoon.
Right.
That no one ever really saw. I mean, we've now included it in, extras and things and DVDs, but it was never intended to be seen unless and only in Europe if the pilot had never gone. But from that, it allowed us to dig deeper into that vein. And, we found a lot that was very useful to us.
So, Mark, one of the great things, obviously, there are many great things about the show, but it was a real experience for the audience, and you did not tell us everything. And there was an idea or a sense like people are smart and want to participate. It was just radically different. And it grew this global cult, really. Can you talk about that, how you were designing things?
There were two influences at work on me for that reason. One was my dad had worked in TV during the Golden Age. He was the stage manager and floor director of Philco Playhouse in the 50s during the Golden Age. So I had grown up hearing stories of his work with Lumet and Frankenheimer and Delbert Mann and all these great actors that passed through there. And that was aspirational television. That was like Chayefsky and Serling and Reginald Rose, the best writers of the day, Gore Vidal, doing their best work. I thought, well, why can't TV be like that now? So that was one strain. The other was that we had broken some ground with Hill Street's style of storytelling, which was to span stories over multiple episodes, which no one had really done. We would often have a self-contained piece in the story, but our usual arc was to take something over 3 or 4 episodes. And occasionally we'd have a runner that would go over the course of a season. So I was emboldened by that to say, why can't we make this a novelistic experience where each episode is in effect a chapter of an ongoing story? And if the audience is smart, and I knew that audience existed from the Hill Street experience, that there might be a hunger for that.
And clearly you were right, because so many things now, even if we cut to today, right? I mean, the relationship, I'm a real television watcher. I love television because I also love to read books and I love characters. So I want to spend as much time as I possibly can with these characters. And when television is good, we can stay with these people and they really get under your skin in a very different way,
Absolutely. And the other thing that I wanted to do, I wanted something, and I only talked about this with David. I said, I want to be subversive. I would like to tunnel under the kind of bland network infrastructure and create something that breaks the mold and opens people's minds to things, not just content-wise, but also form-wise, that they will sit still for this if we can figure out a way to keep their interest.
Now, do you sit down at the beginning And do you have particular literature in mind when you're thinking about this story? Do you have references that are deep in the past? Who do you go back to?
Well, I was a voracious reader, as you could imagine, and I think the antecedents for Twin Peaks are pretty far-reaching. Things like Winesburg, Ohio came to mind for me.
I can see that, actually. I never would have put those two together, but that actually is a pretty good reference, especially that opening scene of Winesburg, Ohio with the hands.
That's
and
right.
Everything. Yeah.
Our Town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Our Town.
Wilder was one of my favorite authors who always went off in different directions every time.
Mm-hmm.
Our Town with a twist.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Russian novels, the darkness, the mysticism, that whole kind of school of writing.
Oh, Dostoevsky and
Chekhov and the lower depths. All of that was there. The presence of darkness in the Russian mindset. And then things like Washington Irving.
Do you always go back to literature in your work more than a movie or a... Because I could see you going back to Serling in some kinds of ways for this, but do you...
Just Serling was fundamental to me. I learned a whole lot about what was possible from him. But yeah, there were films that came into my mind. Actually, a weird reference, but I think it's an apt one, was A Place in the Sun, which originally was an American tragedy, Theodore Dreiser, which is about a murder not unlike this one that disrupts the life of a town. But George Stevens' movie is, it's perfect. And the sense of distilled grief and longing. And we actually talked about that movie during the making of it. And I think David captured some of that intensity with the young love stories and the sense of grand passions that only young people can kind of feel. So yeah, a lot of those sort of references informed this.
Today's sponsor is Mammoth Genesis. We are embarking on an unprecedented journey to bring the woolly mammoth back from extinction and reintroduce it into the Alaskan tundra. Utilizing cutting-edge genetic technology and cloning techniques, our international team aims to recreate these iconic creatures and establish a sustainable population in their ancient homeland. Have you ever dreamt of being part of a groundbreaking project that will rewrite history? This is your chance. This is not just any animal care position. We need individuals with a strong background in large mammal care. Your expertise will prepare these prehistoric giants for a successful life in the wild. This is more than a job. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make history and contribute to the balance of our planet's biodiversity. Join us in turning the dream of the woolly mammoth's return into a reality. Apply today and be part of this historic journey. David's work is so singular. He's such a singular artist. As a director, he's totally unique. You can see things of him directing, and he's very, very specific,
Yes.
How was that with him working as a writer?
Well, the advantage that we had was that we already had 2 years of working together, and we got along famously.
Yeah.
And we laughed at the same things. So we always had I always compared it to playing tennis with somebody. Like, you can only play tennis with somebody who's kind of at your skill level, because otherwise you're just standing there watching the ball whiz by your head all day.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Me too. It wasn't my sport, but because we could return serve and we could charge the net and volley with each other, it was a tremendous amount of fun. And it was sort of no holds or barred. I told him, look, you have to understand the reality of the people that we're going to be dealing with at the network level. So let's just pretend there is no net. There are no lines on the edge of the court, and you let me worry about that, because I had a master class from Bochco in how to handle standards and practices, folks.
It's interesting. I watched an interview you did right before the pandemic, actually, where you said you didn't get notes, or somehow you put guardrails. Is that true, that you were able to keep the network, just keep them there, and you were able to really create this, which who knows if that could ever happen again in the same way?
Yeah, and it's almost like, they won't take kindly to this analogy, but it was like training a dog. In the very first meeting, after we'd written the pilot, which they professed to love, and at one point, a junior executive reached into his pocket and said, well, we've got some notes for you. Would you like to hear them? And we both said at the same time, no.
Yeah.
It was like, it was like you just hit your leg with a newspaper and the dog sits straight with this shocked look in their eyes.
Yeah.
But that set the limit, right? I mean, yeah, they would send me droves of things with every script, and I would, for the most part, say thank you very much and never respond. Or, Mel Brooks said the funniest thing to me ever. He said, whenever you're in a meeting with these guys, just tell them you'll do everything. Say yes to everything. And then don't do any of it, because they're not going to remember. That's not their job. Their job is to just tell them to you.
That's funny. Were you working with Mel Brooks?
No, but I got to meet him because David had done Elephant Man, and my literary director at Victor represented him. So
it's still kind of hard to find the connection between Mel Brooks and Elephant Man. It seems to be getting more distant and more distant.
I know.
So Laura Palmer, do you start with that as a root of the show?
Yes. That was our in. Yeah.
And there's such a complexity to her character. Does that all come in the beginning? Do you start with that?
Forgive me if I've told this story before online or in a podcast. I don't remember if I have, but there were two things in my own background that led me to this. One, in this place that my family had and still has for over a century in upstate New York, I had a grandmother who sort of had a foot in both worlds, was a very sophisticated woman who'd helped run the WPA music program and a renowned violinist, but she also loved living in the country. And she told this story when I was a kid that haunted me and my brother. It was a ghost story, and it was supposedly real. The spirit of a young woman who had been murdered, and I've since done all the backstory to find out who she was. And I think 1910, her body was found floating in a cow pond on the way up the mountain by two drunk loggers, and it became a huge scandal. And some people think it was the inspiration for an American tragedy, which brings the whole thing sort of weirdly full circle. So I'd been hearing these stories about this murder in the woods my whole life. That mystery was never officially solved, by the way, even though there was a famous trial. And in my own life, when I was 13 years old, my dad at that point was working for a guy who was very successful as a real estate man, and we were friendly with the family. And they had one daughter a year older than I was and a son a year younger. She was in a private school in Vancouver. And my parents took me aside one day and said, "We've had terrible news. Susan was kidnapped and murdered at the school in Vancouver. Her parents are on their way up to bring the body back. Their son, Sandy, my friend, is going to be staying with us this weekend. And you can't tell him."
Yes.
So the combination of those two things on my young imagination were, at least in terms of my suggesting it, that's where Laura Palmer came from.
And Sheriff Truman, was he a person who was walking around that you knew who had embodied that kind of integrity and that kind of thing? Or was he a composite?
I think he was a composite. That's such a strange field of reference I'm about to give you. He was a composite in my mind of Andy Griffith.
Really? I can see that. No, I can see that.
And Jimmy Stewart's character, even though he's not a sheriff, in Anatomy of a Murder.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
Just a guy of peerless integrity, not the brightest guy in the world, but solid, dependable. I mean, because the network wanted, the Fed comes in and the local guy's got to be mad and they've got to have conflict and and all this cliched nonsense. And I said, no, they're going to be best friends.
Right.
And by the way, that's Holmes and Watson, which was the other template for their relationship.
How much research, or if any, did you do when you went back to revisit the world of Twin Peaks years later?
Well, the first thing we had to do was look at it again, because neither of us had looked at an episode, I don't think, since they'd aired. You don't go back and look at things that you've done. It's like all you see are the boo-boos, it's like,
right.
But it had sat, obviously it had been on the shelf for quite a while, but it had found this new life in the DVDs, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. And David and I would talk about it from time to time, and I would say, maybe someday, and he'd say, yeah, not yet, but maybe someday. So I went to him, I think, as early as 2012 and said, I think it might be the time to start thinking about it. And he agreed. And we spent literally a year, I think, talking about what it might be and what we might do with it before we ever wrote a word. And then we decided to write it ourselves and not tell anybody, so we could just, again, control it and sell it on spec. And so that's what we did. And so we thought, okay, well, let's go back and look at just the last episode of the second season. And we were screening it at David's house, and almost the last line in the show is, in the red room, Laura Palmer whispers to Cooper, "I'll see you again in 25 years. And then I went, okay, that's 2013. We went off the air in 92. Maybe we can get on the air by 17, and there's our in. I mean, we literally looked at each other, and it was like telepathic. We just went, there you go.
And then you wrote a novel about World War II. How did you decide to do that?
I guess growing up when I did, the sons of World War II vets, my dad was in the Navy, but he was in the first wave of D-Day. And literally the first boat as a minesweeper. The mythology of those days, that war, the sacrifices. I'd had a great uncle who was FDR's secretary, who I knew when I was a kid, who'd written a book about his relationship with him, a diary he'd kept during the war. So World War II loomed large, in our imagination, and I'd always wanted to write something about it. And I came across a reference to something that was about to become declassified after 50 years. I think it was in 1990, what was 50 years from 2005, at the end of the war. They declassified some secret intelligence that I ended up being the first person to see it, and learned that there had been a serious attempt during the Battle of the Bulge to create an elite company of German soldiers who spoke flawless English to infiltrate enemy lines. And we've seen it depicted a couple times, like in the Battle of the Bulge, the film. You see these soldiers changing signs around and stuff.
Right.
That was what they fell back on doing. The original imperative had been from Hitler, infiltrate behind the lines and kill Eisenhower. So that was a story. I said, I got to write this. And that became the second objective, the book. And I've been trying to get the movie made ever since, because I think it's a heck of a story, and it's also real.
When you're thinking of your novels or your stories, do you think about the place all the time too? In Twin Peaks, there's owls, there's forests, there's all these things. Is that all a part of it before you start?
Yeah, and I've always been a big believer in first-person research. I get a lot from going somewhere that I'm going to write about, which I did with that World War II book. I went back and traced the steps of those soldiers. I mean, they were trying to get to Versailles, to SHAEF headquarters, and I visited all those locations, and I always find you get a lot from those things. And in The List of Seven, I did the same thing. I had actually written this chapter already that takes place in the basement of the British Museum, which I posited held all of the great treasures that the Brits had stolen when they were the empire, that they'd never let anybody see, which turned out to actually be true.
Right.
And so, some of these things turn out to be kind of weirdly prescient. So yeah, I'm a big believer in the sensory experience of actually seeing and feeling a place and then finding it. I mean, and when we wrote Twin Peaks, we moved it from North Dakota, obviously, to the Northwest. And we went up to do our first location scout for the possible pilot. We went everywhere for 4 days until someone said, well, the only place I can think of that we haven't shown you is this little town called North Bend. And I said, well, show it to us. And we drove into North Bend, and it was all there already. The hotel above the waterfall. I mean, literally, we had written it. The train tracks coming through town, the little station, the diner. I mean, it was all there. Yeah, I'm a big believer in those things. Will
there be more Twin Peaks? You've expanded the world so much. Are you going to continue to expand the world?
It's hard to say. I mean, I wrote 2 pretty big books about it for this last go around, and I've extended the mythology in both directions and built out the world. It's always possible. We haven't talked about it, but we didn't talk about season 3 for an awfully long time either. So,
can I just ask you, where we are now in 2024, in the world of media, television, we've got AI, everything. What are you seeing, and are you still seeing imagination, creativity? It's a very different process now. We would have all been committed if we'd all watched Twin Peaks in one sitting, right? It was crazy.
Yeah.
So How do you think about the way we're consuming now stories?
Well, I'm a little bit of two minds. I mean, particularly the third season, I described to somebody as digital ayahuasca.
Yeah.
We need things like this to kind of jolt us out of our complacency and our mindset. It's so easy to get stuck and concretized and be run by, fear loops and loathing loops and hatred loops, which are fully on display. I mean, I do think this has been a golden age of storytelling and television, and the ones that came after us, like The Sopranos, I think is the next one that set the bar that high. And since then, we've had one after the other that's been exemplary and continue to be. Along with it, we have an ocean of dreck. But so you have to be more selective. I mean, I've described going into Netflix, it's like getting lost in Costco, which is just intentional. It's like the maze in The Shining. You can't, how do I get out of here? I can't find anything I'm looking for. But boy, I'd really like to take those freeze-dried yak pellets with me home. It's like, it's weird. And that's, as I've learned, it's by conscious design. They don't want you to leave the walled garden.
Right.
So I think it's on the consumer. The consumer has got to learn to be more discerning. What do I want out of this experience? What am I looking for? How do I curate my own intake of what's, honestly, it's the largest amount of story material that human beings have ever been provided.
What inspires you now?
Well, the thing I've been working on for a few years now is that story I told you about my uncle and FDR. This, I'm writing the next book, is the story of his presidency told from my uncle's point of view, and the story of the whole Roosevelt plan and the mystery of who FDR really was, because as iconic as he is, nobody really knew him. And my uncle, I think, had the skeleton key to who he was, knowing him as he did. So I'm going to finish that this year. And then, I've got a bunch of things I'm interested in. They all pull me in sort of different directions, but they have to satisfy those criteria. It's got to be something I'm willing and interested to invest 2 years of my life in. And at a certain point, you realize I don't have that many more 2-year periods to commit to things. So you better be selective. So I'm in that process. I don't know exactly what the next thing is going to be, but I've got a bunch of things lined up on the runway.
The things that attract you, is there a mystery to them, an ambiguity to them, a supernatural element to them? What's the thing that you spark to?
Not always, with some frequency, but I'm interested in understanding the human experience. I mean, I wrote 3 books about golf, which no one saw coming, but I loved the game. And I had a Scottish grandfather who taught the history of the game to me. So I ended up chronicling the American history of the development of the sport and the game. And we made a very successful film out of the first one, and we're hoping to make one out of the third one in that series. So it's by no means only those, but when you think about golf, I think about the mysticism that's inherent in places, to my mind, like the Scottish Highlands, where it was invented, and the town of St. Andrews, where it grew up. So those are the things I find worth devoting, my time to. I'd like to go back and do some work in the theater, and maybe try to develop a musical or two.
Yeah,
because I think the American musical, which I grew up listening to, because my parents had lived in Manhattan during those boon years. I've always loved music. I'd like to incorporate that into my work in some way. Got a whole idea I'm developing about a strange mystical relationship between America and Brazil, which I'm thinking of hooking up. So yeah, there's still a lot that interests me.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure. It was really fun to talk to you.